a duke, his estranged brother, and the woman who negotiated with both of them. When Miss Clara Pembridge arrived at Hartwell Park to restructure her family's debt, the Duke dismissed her in 4 words. So she walked to the end of the high street and made a deal with the one man the Duke hadn't spoken to in 5 years. He saw the handshake through the window. He counted the seconds. And that was the moment everything started to come apart and come together. The village of Ashcroft sat at the edge of no one's particular ambition. It was too far from Bath to be fashionable and too close to the Duke of Hartwell's estate to be entirely free. The inhabitants had learned, across 2 generations of Cavendish tenure, that the Duke's shadow fell long and that it was wiser to step out of it quietly than to contest its reach. Miss Clara Pembridge had not grown up in Ashcroft. She arrived in the 3rd week of October 1817, with a trunk, a leather satchel worn soft at the corners, and the expression of a woman who had already decided how the next conversation would go. She had come to see the Duke. The debt her father had left behind him, £640 accumulated across 11 years of poor harvests, a failed investment in a mill that never opened, and the kind of willful optimism that looks like courage until the creditor arrives, had passed, along with the Pembridge name and the Pembridge house and the Pembridge problem, to Clara's brother. Edmund Pembridge was 17 and at school in Winchester. He was also, until he reached his majority, Clara's legal responsibility. The ecclesiastical court in Gloucester had granted her letters of administration over the estate 8 months prior, on the grounds that Edmund was a minor and there was no other suitable party. The solicitor who had handled it had looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man who had found the correct legal instrument and was not entirely comfortable with it. Clara had thanked him and left before he could reconsider. The practical effect of the letters was narrow. She could act on Edmund's behalf in matters of debt and estate administration. She could sign documents. She could negotiate. The social effect of a woman doing these things in her own person was a separate matter, and one she had decided to manage as it arose. She had written to the Duke 3 times. Twice a secretary had replied. The 3rd letter had received no reply at all, which she took as a form of answer, not a refusal precisely, but an absence that expected her to fill it with surrender. She had not surrendered. She had instead arranged lodgings in Ashcroft, packed her satchel, and come in person. Hartwell Park sat 2 miles from the village on a rise of ground that made it visible from most directions. It was a handsome house in the Palladian style, which is to say it was designed to impress and succeeded. Clara observed it from the lane without being impressed. She had seen handsome houses before. They tended, in her experience, to belong to men who confused their architecture with their character. She was shown into a morning room and left to wait. She did not fidget. She examined the room, the quality of the plasterwork, a portrait above the mantelpiece of a man who shared the Duke's jaw, but not his expression. The painted face was open, even warm. She studied it for a moment longer than she had intended. The Duke arrived 18 minutes after she did. She knew because she had counted. Julian Cavendish was 28 years old and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who had never been required to move through a room quickly. He was dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed well without effort, and he looked at her the way men of his station sometimes looked at a piece of furniture that had appeared in the wrong room, not with hostility, but with a mild, settled puzzlement about who had authorized its presence. "Miss Pembridge," he did not sit, "I received your letters." "All 3, she said. It was not a question." A brief pause. "All 3. Then you are aware of the proposal I put forward in the 2nd. "I am aware that you put forward a proposal." He moved to the window, which she interpreted as a wish to have the light behind him. She turned slightly so that it was not. "Your father's debt is a settled matter. The terms were agreed upon between himself and my estate agent in 1814. The terms were agreed upon by a man who did not, with respect, fully understand them." She opened the satchel and produced 3 letters, folded and marked with small marginal annotations in a neat, close hand. The repayment schedule assumed a rental income from the Pembridge tenancies that has not existed since 1815, when the eastern fields flooded. There is no mechanism in the original agreement for a revision of terms. My father did not ask for one because he believed the income would recover. It has not. The Duke looked at the letters without taking them. The terms stand regardless of circumstance. They stand legally, Clara said. I am not disputing that. She set the letters on the table beside her, squared their edges. I am proposing a renegotiation. The estate can service the debt if the schedule is extended by 4 years, and the interest rate is revised downward by 2%. I have brought the calculations. I act in this matter as administrator of my brother's estate, with the authority of the court's letters." She produced a second document. He did not look at it. "Miss Pembridge." His voice was patient in the way that certain men's voices were patient, a patience that was less a virtue than a management strategy. "I appreciate the difficulty of your position, but I do not conduct matters of business with ladies." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at him. She did not look away, and she did not colour or flinch or reformulate. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that catalogued what she saw and declined to be altered by it. "I see," she said. She collected the letters. She collected the calculations. She replaced them in the satchel and closed the clasp and stood. "Then I will not take more of your time." She left. Her footsteps on the marble of the entrance hall were even and unhurried. The great front door opened and closed. Julian Cavendish stood at the window and watched her walk down the drive. She did not look back. He told himself this was as it should be. The debt was legitimate. The terms were agreed. His father had always said that sentiment in finance was the first step toward ruin, and Julian had found no particular reason to disagree. He had enough to manage without revising old agreements for the benefit of women who arrived uninvited with annotated letters and the expressions of people who had already decided how conversations would go. He turned from the window. It took him until evening to notice that she had left the calculations behind. The village of Ashcroft had one lending library, which shared its premises with a stationer's shop and smelled pleasantly of paper and old binding. Clara found it on her second morning and spent an hour there, partly for the books, and partly because the proprietress, a Mrs. Holt, was the sort of woman who knew everything that happened in a 5-mile radius and was sufficiently gratified by an interested listener to share it freely. "The young Duke," Mrs. Holt said with the particular inflection Ashcroft applied to Julian Cavendish, respectful, cautious, slightly aggrieved, "has been at Hartwell Park for 3 months now, longer than usual. He generally only comes for the summer." "Is there something keeping him here?" Mrs. Holt arranged a stack of almanacs with unnecessary precision. "There is his brother." Clara looked up from the book she was examining. "His brother?" "Mr. Thomas Cavendish lives in the village and has done for 2 years. He and the Duke do not—" Mrs. Holt pursed her lips. "Correspond." "They are estranged." "Quite thoroughly. There was some falling out after their father took ill years ago now before the old Duke died. Something about a letter or a misunderstanding. No one knows quite what. Mr. Thomas keeps to himself and does not speak of it. The Duke—" a pause— "also does not speak of it." "How long ago did the father die?" 3 years past. 1814. It was very sudden toward the end. He had been ill a long while, but the final months were—" Mrs. Holt shook her head. "The brothers were not on speaking terms before he died. And after, they have been less so." Clara filed this information in the part of her mind that organized itself without being asked to. She bought a copy of Cowper's poems, thanked Mrs. Holt, and walked out into the October light. Thomas Cavendish's office was at the end of the High Street as described. It had a modest sign, recently repainted. Through the window she could see shelves of documents and a man at a desk. He was fair where his brother was dark, and he looked up when her shadow crossed the glass. She did not go in, not yet. She walked back to her lodgings, sat at the small table, and looked at the document she had left, intentionally, on the Duke's morning room table. She had brought 2 copies. She always brought 2 copies because she had learned that the first meeting was rarely the last one, and that leaving something behind gave a man something to hold after you had gone. It was a calculated risk. Everything was a calculated risk when the alternative was losing your brother's inheritance. The calculations reached Julian 2 days later, returned via his estate agent with a note that said only, "These appear to have been left in error. His Grace returns them with compliments." Clara read this twice. Then she wrote a reply. "They were not left in error. His Grace may find them useful regardless. Miss Pembridge's proposal, made in her capacity as administrator of the Pembridge estate, remains open until the 1st of November." She sealed it, sent it, and went to call on Thomas Cavendish. He received her in his office with the slightly startled courtesy of a man unaccustomed to morning callers. He was 31, with Julian's jaw and none of Julian's armour. His desk was covered in maps, and he moved 2 aside to make room for her to sit, which she appreciated. "Miss Pembridge," he said when she had explained her situation. "The Pembridge tenancy, yes, I know the land. I surveyed it for the owner of the adjacent property." He found a map without searching for it. The Eastern Fields. The same. He studied her calculations for longer than his brother had. He turned the paper over, examined the figures on the reverse, and set it down. "These are sound," he said. "I know." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile. "You've been to see Julian." "I have." A silence. He did not ask how it had gone. Perhaps the answer was evident. "And you've come to me." "I've come to discuss an alternative arrangement. You handle conveyancing. There are legal instruments, assignment of debt, for instance, a third party acquiring the obligation at a discount." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You want me to consider buying the debt from my brother?" "I want you to consider whether it would be advantageous. The discount I would offer is 10%. The revised repayment terms I proposed to the Duke, which he declined to consider, would apply." He looked at the map, then at the calculations, then at her. "You understand that this would not please Julian?" "I imagine not. You understand that Thomas and I are—" He stopped, started again. "This would not be a comfortable transaction." "No," Clara agreed. "I don't imagine it would be." A longer silence. Outside, the high street went about its business. "Give me 2 days," Thomas said. Clara stood. She extended her hand. He shook it. Julian saw it from the street. He had come to the village on estate business and had no reason to walk past his brother's office. He had, in fact, every reason not to. He had not set foot in that street in the 2 years since Thomas had taken the office. He could not have said precisely what had brought him down it today. He was passing the window when he saw them, his brother at the desk, a woman opposite with her back to the glass. Her posture was composed and upright in the particular way he had already memorized without meaning to. Between them, papers. Thomas looked up, said something, and the woman stood and extended her hand. Thomas took it. Julian walked on. He reached the end of the street, turned the corner, and stood in the shadow of the church wall. She had come to his brother. The same proposal, the same document laid before Thomas, who had looked at it and considered it and shaken hands on it. Julian had been outmaneuvered through a window. He thought, it was a business transaction. He thought, she warned me, the 1st of November. He thought, Thomas. That last thought he did not follow. He had made a practice of not following it. His father had made him promise, formalizing what had already been broken, giving it the weight of a deathbed vow, and Julian had kept the promise because promises to the dying were the only kind that could not be renegotiated, and because it had been easier in the years since to keep it than to examine whether the thing that had broken them was what he remembered. He walked back to Hartwell Park and went directly to his study and sat at his desk for some time without reading the letters on it. On the corner of the desk, weighted under a paperweight, were Clara's calculations. He had not returned them to the agent. He had, without quite meaning to, read them. They were sound. The 1st of November came and went. Julian did not reply. Thomas had not concluded his review of the instruments. Clara, who had budgeted 3 weeks in Ashcroft and was now entering her 4th, extended her lodgings and said nothing to anyone about it. She walked in the afternoons when her correspondence was done and the light was still good. Ashcroft sat in rolling country, hedged lanes, a river visible from the higher ground, the pale gold of late-season fields. She walked for the clarity it gave her thinking, and because her lodgings were small, and Mrs. Carr's spaniel believed strongly in company. On a Tuesday in the 2nd week of November, she encountered the Duke. He was on horseback, coming around a bend in a lane that was technically public and practically used only by Hartwell Park. He pulled up easily. The horse was grey and better mannered than the situation required. They looked at each other. "Miss Pembridge." "Your Grace." Neither of them spoke for a moment. A crow called from somewhere to the left. "You are still in Ashcroft," he said. "I am still in Ashcroft," she agreed. He looked as though he intended to say something, and then decided against it. He was a man who managed himself in public with considerable precision, every word chosen, every silence tactical. What she had not expected was what she saw now at the edge of his expression, something closer to a question he hadn't wanted to arrive at. "I have read your calculations," he said. She waited. "They are not unreasonable." "I know," she said. The edge of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "You might allow me the appearance of conceding something." "You haven't conceded anything yet, Your Grace. You've complimented my arithmetic." The not-quite smile held for a moment. He looked at her with an attention that was different from their first meeting, more specific, as though he were revising a calculation of his own. "My brother," he said. "You have spoken with him." "I have. About the debt." Among other things. His expression closed slightly. What other things? The eastern fields, the history of the tenancy. He surveyed the adjacent land. He had useful context. She held his gaze. He is very capable, Your Grace. I imagine you know that. A pause long enough to mean something. What did he say? About the debt. About... He stopped. The horse shifted and he steadied it with one hand, the gesture entirely unconscious. About anything. He said very little that was personal. He is not the sort of man who uses a business meeting to address private grievances. Nor am I. She paused. But I noticed he did not speak of you with anger. Julian said nothing. That is all I will say on the subject, Clara said. It is not my business. No, he agreed, it is not. But he did not ride on. He sat on the grey horse in the lane while the crow called again, and Clara waited with the patience of a woman who had learned that silence, correctly held, was a more effective instrument than most people credited it with being. The proposal, he said at last, the restructuring, I am prepared to consider it. I am glad to hear it. I will need to review it with my agent. Of course. It may take some time. I have extended my lodgings. He looked at her steadily. So I understand. He touched his hat, formal but not cold, and rode on. Clara walked on in the opposite direction, toward the higher ground where the river was visible, and thought about the man in the portrait, the open face, the warmth that Julian Cavendish had locked somewhere and covered over with architecture. She thought about Thomas, who had kept his brother's name carefully out of his voice. She thought, whatever happened between them, both of them are still carrying it. She did not examine what she thought about the Duke himself. She was a practical woman. She had learned to be. The review with the estate agent took 4 days. On the 5th day, a note arrived, written in a hand she had not seen before, close and deliberate, no flourish. His Grace the Duke of Hartwell requests the pleasure of Miss Pembridge's company at Hartwell Park on Thursday at 2 o'clock to discuss the matter of the Pembridge tenancy. She noted the formality. She noted the phrasing, drawing-room language applied to a legal meeting, which told her something about the register he had chosen. Not a concession, or not only. A repositioning. She wrote back, Miss Pembridge is pleased to accept. She arrived precisely at 2. She was shown into the study, not the morning room, a signal. The study was where real business was conducted. The morning room was where one managed visitors one had not expected to matter. Mr. Fossey, the estate agent, was present. The calculations were on the desk. Julian was standing, but he moved to his chair when she entered and gestured for her to sit, which she did. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. Mr. Fossey asked several questions. Clara answered them. Julian said less than either of them, but he listened with the quality of attention that is different from performance, specific, settled, the listening of a man who has decided to take something seriously. At the end of 90 minutes, Mr. Fossey gathered his papers and excused himself. Julian and Clara were left alone. He will draw up the revised agreement, Julian said. He was looking at the desk rather than at her. 4 years extension, the rate as you proposed. Thank you, Clara said. He looked up. Don't thank me, the numbers support it. I should have looked at them more carefully to begin with. A pause. He stopped. You were dismissive, she said. Yes. The word arrived without qualification. She had not expected that. I was dismissive, he said again as though verifying it. And the proposal was sound, and those are not separate problems. He looked at her. I apologize, Miss Pembridge. Accepted, she said. Simply without reassurance, it was enough. He picked up a pen and set it down. The study was quiet. Outside, November wind moved through the park. My brother, he said. Clara waited. Has he agreed to the alternative arrangement? He was still reviewing the instruments when you sent your note. The arrangement with you, if it proceeds, supersedes the question. Julian nodded slowly. He would have done it if I had refused again. Yes, Clara said, I believe he would. Because it was sound. Because it was sound, she agreed, and perhaps for other reasons. He looked at her. His expression was not hostile. It was the expression of a man who has picked up an object he thought he knew and found it heavier than expected. What other reasons? That is not my business, she said. You said the same thing before. It is still true. He was quiet then. But you have an opinion. I have several, I keep them. The not-quite smile again, warmer than before. That must be very crowded. Considerably, she agreed. He stood. The meeting was over, formally speaking, and he walked her to the study door. At the threshold he paused, as if the hallway required some final arrangement. "The 1st of November," he said. "Your deadline." "Yes." I did not reply. "No. I should have." He said it to the doorframe rather than to her, which she found she preferred. A man who apologized directly to your face was performing something. A man who apologized to the doorframe was telling the truth. I have a difficulty sometimes with revision, with examining what I believe to be true and finding I was mistaken. "Most people do," Clara said. "Most people do not conduct their difficulty by refusing to discuss matters of business with women." She looked at him. He had colored slightly, not dramatically, but enough. It was the first genuine discomfort she had seen in him, and it was better than the armor. "No," she agreed. "Most people conduct it differently." She walked down the hall. At the front door she paused and turned back. He was still standing at the threshold of his study, watching her. "For your grace," she said. "The word negotiate. It simply means an attempt to reach agreement through discussion. Both parties must be willing. That is all it requires." She left. The door closed behind her with the same quiet finality as before, but the silence it left was a different kind. Thomas Cavendish called at her lodgings the following Monday in the morning and accepted tea. "Julian is proceeding with the restructuring," he said. "He is." "You manage that with some efficiency." "Perhaps with something like admiration, carefully expressed. I had wondered what you would do when he refused you." "I had options," Clara said. "You had me." He looked at her steadily. "You came to me deliberately, not only because it was a sound arrangement." "It was a sound arrangement," she said. "Also because it would inconvenience Julian." "Yes," she admitted, "also that." He nodded, unsurprised. "Did it occur to you that it might worsen things between us, Julian and I?" "It occurred to me," Clara said. "It also occurred to me that the current situation between you appeared to be causing sufficient harm already." Thomas was quiet. He looked at the window. "You don't know what happened?" "No." "You don't know who was wrong?" "No. But I notice you speak of him without anger, and I have noticed he speaks of you with something that is not quite indifference." "What is it, then?" Clara considered. "Effort," she said. "He is working very hard not to care." Thomas looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not quite pain, but the relation of pain. "There was a letter," he said, "written by our father's physician about the nature of the illness, what it was doing to his mind. I sent it to Julian. I wanted him to understand why father was saying things that were not, that were confused." He stopped. "Julian believed I had forged it, that I was trying to discredit what father had told him. He believed that for 5 years. And the vow your father extracted formalized what was already broken," Thomas said. "Father thought he was protecting the estate. He was frightened, and his mind had been, he believed things that were not so. Julian kept the vow because it was the last thing father asked of him, and questioning it would have meant questioning everything." Clara was very still. "Does Julian know about the letter, that it was genuine?" "He will," Thomas said. "I intend to tell him." He stood, set down his teacup. "You are a very unusual woman, Miss Pembridge." "I am a practical one," she said. "Practicality sometimes resembles perception." He smiled. A full smile, not his brother's guarded version. "If you are in Ashcroft much longer, you will have sorted all of us out." "I have my own affairs to attend to," Clara said. "I don't make a habit of sorting people." "And yet," he said. She declined to answer that. The revised agreement was signed on the 22nd of November. Clara signed her name, Clara Ann Pembridge, full as she always did, her authority as administrator stated cleanly beneath, and Julian signed his, and Mr. Fossey witnessed it, and that was the legal end of the matter. She should have left Ashcroft that week. She told herself she stayed because there were details to arrange with the tenant farmers, practical matters of management that required her presence. This was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was murkier and less convenient, and she was a practical woman, which meant she was better at identifying inconvenient truths than at knowing what to do with them. What she did instead was walk. She walked the lanes and visited Mrs. Holt and called on Thomas twice more on matters that were less and less business as the days passed, and she encountered the Duke 3 more times in circumstances that were, each time, entirely natural and entirely unlikely. The first was at the lending library. He was there when she arrived, apparently returning a volume of agricultural correspondence, which was either the most dutiful reading she had ever heard of, or an excuse so dull it had to be genuine. He saw her. She saw him. They were both present in a public shop with Mrs. Holt behind the counter, which meant the encounter was perfectly proper, and also the longest 20 minutes Clara had spent in some time. They talked about a pamphlet on drainage that they had both recently read. She had mentioned it in a letter to Thomas, which apparently Thomas had mentioned to Julian, which was a chain of information she found worth noting. "You disagree with his method," Julian said. "He assumes labour that isn't available," Clara said, "and he ignores clay soil in the lower fields. His method works for chalk. It doesn't translate." Julian looked at her with the specific attention she was becoming familiar with. "You know this from the Pembridge tenancy, from 5 years of reading agricultural correspondence, because no one else in the household was going to." She said it without self-pity, only as information. "My father had the instinct for it, but not the method. I had the method and no authority." A pause. "That is the situation I was managing." "You have been managing it since his death." "Yes." He was quiet. He was not looking at the pamphlet. "How old were you when he died?" 22. A silence. "That is a great deal to manage at 22. "It is not unusual." "It is unusual," he said, with a mild certainty that had nothing of the morning-room manner in it. "It may not be uncommon, but it is a great deal." She looked at him. He was not offering pity. She would have closed the conversation if he had. He was offering accuracy, which was more disarming. "Thank you," she said. And then, before the moment could become something she hadn't planned for, his method would work better if he accounted for river levels in spring. "I've made a note in the margins." She produced the pamphlet from her satchel. "Since we have apparently been reading in parallel." He took it, looked at the annotations, her close, careful hand, then up at her. "May I keep this?" "Turn till you've read them," she said. "I want it back." He left soon after, which was decorous. Mrs. Holt said nothing until the door had closed, and then said, "He has never before come in on a Tuesday," and then returned to her shelving with the satisfied expression of a woman filing useful information. The second encounter was at the churchyard. She was passing through on her way to the higher ground, and he was standing at a grave she did not approach closely enough to read. He heard her footsteps on the path and turned, and for a moment she saw something on his face that she did not catalogue, because cataloguing it would have required looking at it, and some things were not for looking at without permission. "Your Grace," she made to pass. "Miss Pembridge." He did not say, "Don't go," he said, "The drainage notes in the pamphlet, they are correct." She stopped, turned back. "I know." He looked at the grave, then at her. "My father is buried at Hartwell Park. This is an old tenant of the estate." He paused. "He died 6 months before my father. My father used to say he was the only man who told him things he didn't want to hear." Clara was quiet. "I have been thinking," Julian said, "about things I was told in the last months of my father's life, that I accepted because he was dying, and I could not—" He stopped. "There are things I accepted that I should have examined. My brother sent me a letter 3 years ago that I did not— I refused to believe it was genuine. I told myself he had fabricated it." He looked at her, and his expression was the most undefended she had seen it. Not vulnerable, honest. "I am beginning to think I was wrong." "About the letter?" "About a number of things." She looked at him. The November sky was flat and pale above the churchyard. Julian Cavendish stood in the middle of it with the look of a man who had just set down something very heavy. "That is a hard thing to come to," she said. "Yes." "When the structure you've built around a mistake is load-bearing," she said, "you cannot simply remove it. You must understand it first. Most people cannot do that. It requires seeing yourself from the outside." "You speak as though you know it." "I had ideas about what was possible for a woman of my position," she said. "After my father died, I was wrong about most of them. I didn't know that until I tested the wall and found it was not solid." "The wall of what one will not discuss," he said quietly. "Yes, and then because the moment asked for honesty. Your Grace, you are not an unkind man. I don't think you were unkind even when you dismissed me. I think you were a man doing what he had been told was right for so long that he had stopped checking whether it was." Julian said nothing. The wind moved through the churchyard. "That is a generous reading," he said at last. "It is an accurate one," she said. "Accuracy sometimes resembles generosity." He looked at her, and she saw the ghost of a smile. Not the guarded version, something beneath it. "You are going to get your pamphlet back with annotations," he said. "I expect nothing less." She walked on. She was aware for some time after of the quality of the silence she had left him in, not the silence of a dismissed conversation, but the silence of a man sitting with something he had been handed and was only now beginning to open. The third encounter was not an encounter. It was a dinner. Thomas arranged it, which is to say he mentioned to Clara that he had invited her to dinner on Friday, and mentioned to Julian that he had invited him to dinner on Friday, and mentioned to neither that the other was coming. Clara arrived first and understood the situation immediately. She considered leaving. She considered it for approximately 3 seconds. Then she sat down and accepted a glass of wine and decided that if Thomas Cavendish had the nerve for this, she could meet him there. Julian arrived 7 minutes later. He saw Clara, he saw Thomas. Something moved across his face, not anger and not surprise exactly, more a kind of recognition as though he had half expected it and had not admitted this to himself. He sat down. The dinner was by any external measure extraordinary. The three of them ate a very good joint of mutton and talked for 2 hours, about drainage, about the pamphlet, about the history of the Hartwell estate and a disputed Enclosure Act from 1803 that Thomas had been researching. About Cowper, because Clara mentioned she had been reading him, and Julian said he had read him at university and found him sentimental, and Thomas said he found him truthful about the cost of solitude, and the table went briefly quiet in a way that meant something without naming it. At no point did Julian and Thomas address what was between them, but they were in the same room, at a table arranged by the same man, and something was different by the end of it, not repaired, but no longer sealed. After dinner, Thomas contrived to be called away to look at something in his study. Julian and Clara were left at the table. "He is not subtle," Julian said. "He is extremely subtle," Clara said. "He simply decided in this instance not to be." Julian looked at her. In the candlelight he looked different again, the study version of him, the Lane version, layered over the morning room version until the original was barely visible. She was aware that she had become very familiar with the geography of his face. She had not planned to. "Thomas spoke to me this morning," he said. "He told me about the letter. The physician's letter, that it was genuine, that he hadn't—" He stopped. His jaw tightened, not with anger, with effort. That what our father believed at the end was the illness speaking, not the truth. Clara was very still. "I don't know," Julian said, "whether to believe him. Not because I think he is lying, but because I have believed the other thing for 5 years, and if he is right, then I have been wrong. About everything." "About your brother," Clara said, "about the vow. About who I have been since my father died." The candle moved in a breath of air. The house was quiet around them. "That is frightening," Clara said. "Yes. It is also the beginning of something." He looked at her steadily. "Is it? If you can say I may have been wrong and mean it, yes." She held his gaze. "Most people cannot say it. They say something shaped like it, that lets them avoid the weight of the admission." "I have avoided a great many things of weight," he said. And then, with a directness she had not heard from him before, "Miss Pembridge, I have found myself, I am not certain how to—" He stopped, looked at the table, looked at her. "I have been finding reasons to walk certain lanes." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Lanes," she said. "Lanes," he confirmed, "and libraries, and apparently to have opinions about drainage pamphlets. Those opinions were genuine. They were, that is the alarming part." She looked at him. He was not performing. The precision, the managed distance, still there because it was part of him, but underneath it was something else. The man from the portrait. The one with the open face. "Your Grace," she said carefully. "Julian," he said. A pause. "Julian," she said, the first time. "I have extended my lodgings considerably past what the business warranted." He looked at her. "I know. That is not entirely about drainage." "I know," he said again, softer. The candle moved. From the study, nothing. Thomas was giving them considerable time with whatever he was examining. "I don't know what this is," Clara said. She said it with her customary calm, the real kind, not the fortress kind. "I am not certain I know how to be impractical." "I'm not asking you to be impractical," Julian said. "I'm asking whether you would be willing to stay for now. Just stay." "In Ashcroft." "In Ashcroft." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The candle, the quiet house, Thomas in his study, examining something with great attention. "I will need my pamphlet back," she said. Julian's face did something she had not seen it do before. It opened. Not the portrait, something better than the portrait, because it was present tense and alive. "Tomorrow," he said, "with annotations." "Then I suppose," Clara said, "I am staying a little longer." The pamphlet arrived the following morning. It came with a footman, which was excessive, and without a covering note, which was deliberate. The annotations were extensive, loose sheets of paper tucked between the pages, filled in Julian's hand, which was not close and careful like hers, but larger, more pressured, the writing of a man who thought quickly and revised rarely. He had disagreed with her on 2 points, agreed with her on 4, and on the final sheet had written something that was not about drainage at all. The note on page 47 read, "The necessity of foundations before alteration. I have been thinking about this in a different context, J.C." Clara turned to page 47 and read her own note. No drainage system can be meaningfully improved without first understanding what the existing channels were built to do. To alter without that knowledge is not reform. It is simply new damage. She set the pamphlet on the table. She looked out the window at the November street. Then she wrote a reply. The foundation of the existing system is usually a fear that no longer has an object. Once you see that, the rest becomes straightforward. CAP. She sent it back with the footman. By noon, a reply arrived. What if the system was built by someone else, and you inherited it whole, and the fear is not yours, but you have been maintaining it regardless, J.C.? Clara looked at this for a long time. Then the question is whether the house is yours now, whether you are permitted to live in it differently than it was built. You are. CAP. The reply came within the hour. I would like to discuss this in person, somewhere neutral. J.C. The lending library is neutral. CAP. The lending library has Mrs. Holt. J.C. Clara smiled, a private, unobserved smile, the kind she permitted herself when no one was cataloguing her face. The river path above the village, 3 o'clock. CAP. He was there before her. He was standing at the point where the path crested the rise, and the river became visible below. Pale, wide, the colour of pewter in the November light. He had come without a hat, which was either carelessness or a statement. She decided it was both. Miss Pembridge. You may call me Clara, she said. You have been annotating my pamphlet. Clara. He said it the same way she had said his name at Thomas's dinner, with the slight weight of a word being set down for the first time in its proper place. They walked, not toward anywhere specific. The path simply went, and they went with it. I spoke with Thomas again this morning, Julian said. He was looking at the river. Properly this time, not around the matter. Clara waited. He told me everything. Julian's voice was even, but it was the evenness of effort. What our father believed in those last weeks. The confusion, the accusations he made. Thomas had tried to correct them. The physician's letter was his attempt to show me that father's mind had been compromised, that the things father was saying about Thomas were products of illness and not truth. He paused. Father wouldn't hear the correction. And I decided Thomas had fabricated the letter, that it was a manipulation, a breath. It was not. I knew it, I think, somewhere beneath the knowing, but I had made the vow, and the vow required the letter to be false. So you made it false, Clara said quietly. Yes. He stopped walking. He stood on the path with the river below, and his face had the look of a man standing in the middle of an arithmetic problem he has just discovered the error in. 5 years, Clara. I cut my brother off for 5 years because a dying man whose mind was not his own told me something that wasn't true, and I kept the promise because it was easier than examining it. Not easier, she said. Safer. He looked at her. If you examined it, she said, you might have found it was wrong, and then you would have had to live with having kept a wrong promise for however long you'd kept it. As long as you didn't examine it, you were simply being dutiful. She paused. The grief told you that to question it was disloyalty, so you didn't question it. That is not weakness. That is how grief works. He was quiet for a long time. The river moved below them, slow and pewter. You are, he said at last, the most clear-sighted person I have encountered in a considerable time. I've had practice, she said. Clarity is considerably easier when it concerns other people's situations. And when it is your own? She considered this honestly, considerably harder. He looked at her with the open expression she was still not entirely accustomed to. What is your own situation? Truly. The question was simple and not simple at all. Clara looked at the river. She had not been asked this, the real version of it, in a long time. Most people asked about the debt, the tenancy, the practicalities. They asked about what she was managing, not about who was managing it. I am 25 years old, she said, and I have been the effective head of a household since I was 22, and I am very good at it, and it cost me a great deal that I don't say so to anyone, because saying so would be interpreted as complaint. She paused. I am here in Ashcroft because a man I had never met held a legal instrument over my brother's inheritance, and I had no recourse except competence. That is the whole of my situation, practically speaking. And impractically speaking. She was quiet for a moment. Impractically speaking, she said, I have been walking certain lanes also. Julian said nothing. He turned from the river and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the path was very quiet around them. Clara, he said, and then nothing else for a moment, because apparently her name was sufficient for what he wanted to communicate, and she found it was. She was practical. She was clear-sighted. She was also standing on a path in November with a man who had spent 5 years being wrong about his brother and 3 weeks being revised by a woman with a pamphlet, and there was something alive between them that she had not planned for and could not now categorize away. I should like, Julian said carefully, to call on you formally if you are willing. Formally, she said. To court you, with the appropriate formality. He looked slightly pained at his own construction. I am apparently quite bad at this. You are catastrophically bad at this, she agreed, but the intent is clear. The intent, he said with more warmth than she had heard from him, is that I would like the right to be near you without requiring a drainage pamphlet as a pretext. Clara looked at him. Something in her chest, which she had been maintaining in its usual careful arrangement, shifted. Yes, she said, you may call on me. He exhaled, not dramatically, just the small release of a held breath. It was more telling than any grand gesture. Tomorrow? He said. You have my annotations to return. I have kept them. Julian! They are very good annotations. He looked at her, and the not-quite smile was now entirely a smile, and it was the best thing she had seen in a considerable time. Fine. Tomorrow. I will bring a pretext. Bring no pretext, she said. Just come. He looked at her steadily. Just come, he repeated. That is all. They stood on the path for another moment, and then walked back toward the village together, and the light went with them, and the river went on below without requiring anything of anyone. He came the next day. No pretext. He arrived at 11 o'clock, a morning call entirely correct, and sat in Clara's small lodging room with its low ceiling and the landlady's spaniel investigating his boots, and they talked for 2 hours about nothing that could be recorded in an estate ledger. He told her about his father, the real version, not the managed one, a man who had loved both his sons and been frightened toward the end, in ways that fear made strange. A man who had wanted Julian to be strong in the way dying men sometimes wanted their heirs to be strong, absolutely and without doubt, which is to say in a way no living person can actually be. He told me once, when I was about 12, that a duke does not revise, Julian said. That once a Cavendish has given his word, the word stands. He looked at the spaniel which had settled on his foot. He meant it as strength. I think he was afraid of his own tendency to waver. He taught me his correction rather than his lesson. And you learned it completely. I learned it completely. He looked at her. Until a woman arrived with a leather satchel and annotated letters and declined to interpret my dismissal as a conclusion. Clara smiled. I always bring 2 copies. I know, I've been thinking about that. He paused. You were certain you would need them. I was prepared for the possibility that the first conversation wouldn't go as planned. As it demonstrably didn't. As it demonstrably didn't. She looked at him. I was not, however, prepared for subsequent conversations. No? No, she said. I had a plan through the first meeting. After that I was improvising. Julian looked at her with an expression she was still cataloguing. You don't appear to improvise. That is rather the point. He was quiet a moment, then, what did you think when I said that, the thing I said? He didn't specify. He didn't need to. I thought, Clara said, that you were wrong and that you knew it, and that you had said it anyway because it was the most efficient way to end a conversation you hadn't wanted to have. She paused. I also thought that you had said it before, that it was not a fresh decision, but a habit. It was a habit, he said, a very effective one for avoiding inconvenience. And now? He looked at her steadily. And now I am very willingly inconvenienced, he said, and I find it does not resemble what I expected. What did you expect? I expected it to feel like loss, he said. That is what I was taught, that any departure from the plan was loss, that revision was weakness. He looked at her, his voice quiet and direct and better for being both. What it is, actually, is It is like the drainage. You cannot improve a system without understanding what it was built to do, and once you understand that, you can see that some of the channels were never serving the house at all. They were simply there because someone built them that way, and everyone after assumed they were necessary. Clara looked at him. "That is my annotation," he said, "on the margin of the thing I've been trying to say." The spaniel moved to her feet. The small room with its low ceiling and view of the November street was very quiet. "Julian," she said. "Yes." "So you're going to need to reconcile with your brother." He blinked. It was not what he had expected her to say. "I know." "Not eventually, soon. He has been carrying this as long as you have." "I know." A pause. "I find I am frightened of it." "That is reasonable," she said. "You will be revising in front of someone who was harmed by the unrevised version. That is more frightening than revising alone." She paused. "But Thomas is not waiting for you to be perfect. I think he simply wants to know you are looking at it honestly." Julian was very still. "You know him well in a few weeks." "He is easy to know," she said. "He is not armored." Julian looked at her. "He never was, even as a boy. I was always the one our father pointed to. The heir, the eldest. Thomas was—" He stopped. "I think I have been unjust to him for a very long time. Before the vow. In smaller ways." "That is a hard thing to see." "Yes." He looked at her. "It is easier with you here." "I am not here to make things easier," she said. "I am here because of a debt and a drainage pamphlet." "Also the lanes," he said. "Also the lanes," she admitted. The room was quiet. Julian stood and she stood, and he was quite close in the small space, and neither of them moved to increase the distance. "Clara," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, meaning yes, I am here, yes, I see you. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. Such a small thing, so simple, and it undid approximately 3 years of careful composure. "May I call again tomorrow?" he said. "You may call whenever you like," she said. "No pretext required." He was very close. Close enough that she was aware of him in the specific way that had nothing to do with pamphlets or drainage or the architecture of inheritance. He took her hand, not dramatically, just her hand held carefully in both of his, with the attention he gave to things he was taking seriously. He lifted it and pressed his lips briefly, formally to her knuckles. It was a correct and proper gesture. It was also in this room with this man the most honest thing she had felt in years. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. He left. Clara stood in the small room with the spaniel and the November light and looked at her hand. She did not try to catalogue what she was feeling. For once she simply let it be. Julian went to his brother that afternoon. He walked to Thomas's office on the high street, the street he had avoided for 2 years, and knocked on the door and went in and sat in the chair Clara had sat in on her first visit. Thomas looked at him across the desk. "I know what father told you," Julian said. "I know it wasn't true. I know you tried to tell me and I wouldn't—" He stopped. "I am sorry, Thomas. I am genuinely sorry. For 5 years, and for longer than that." Thomas was very still. "I have been wrong," Julian said, "about the thing I believed about you. I have been wrong about what the vow required, and I have been—" He looked at his brother, and whatever was on his face was not the Hartwell face, the dukedom face. It was the face of the boy in the portrait. "I have been wrong about what father actually wanted for us, not the dying version of him, the man he was." Thomas stood up from behind his desk. He came around it. Julian stood too. They did not have the vocabulary for this, 2 men of their class and era, and it did not matter. Thomas put his hand on Julian's shoulder. Julian put his hand briefly over it. That was the whole of it. They sat down again on the same side of the desk and talked for 3 hours. Outside, the church bell rang 4, then 5, then 6. Thomas's housekeeper knocked twice and was told both times that they were engaged. When Julian left, it was dark. He walked back through the village and back to Hartwell Park and went directly to his study and sat at the desk and did not look at the estate correspondence. He looked at Clara's pamphlet, which he had not returned, and the annotations in the close and careful hand. No drainage system can be meaningfully improved without first understanding what the existing channels were built to do. He had been a drainage system, a house full of channels built by his father's fear and his own grief, maintained because maintenance felt like duty, and duty felt like strength, the whole structure entirely correct and entirely wrong. Clara had walked in with a leather satchel and annotated letters and the stillness of a woman who had learned to find her own way through rooms that weren't built for her. She had not tried to knock anything down. She had simply been present, Still, accurate. And everything had started to revise itself. He sat at the desk for a long time. Then he picked up a pen and began to write. December came to Ashcroft with cold clarity, hard frosts, white mornings, village smoke rising straight in still air. Clara's lodgings were warm enough. Mrs. Carr had taken to sending the spaniel upstairs in the evenings as a supplementary measure. Julian called every day, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon. Occasionally when the afternoon ran long into the early evening, at which point Mrs. Carr's sense of propriety required the sitting-room door to remain open and herself or the spaniel to be audible somewhere nearby, which suited everyone. They fell with a naturalness Clara declined to be alarmed by, into a kind of intimacy that was not yet anything officially nameable, and was not, for either of them, nothing. They argued about books. He had opinions about Cowper that she found entirely wrong. She had opinions about Burke that he found bracing, then persuasive, then quietly unsettling to his prior views. He brought her a volume from Hartwell Park's library, Milton, which she had mentioned once in passing 3 weeks earlier. She brought him a monograph on soil management she had ordered from London, and he read it in 2 days and told her she had been right about the eastern fields. Thomas joined them sometimes, for dinner, for an afternoon walk that involved considerably more talking than walking. The two brothers were cautious with each other still, and gentle, the way people are gentle with a thing that has been broken and reset, and is stronger now but still conscious of where the break was. Clara stayed largely out of it, except when she didn't, at which point she said something accurate and moved on, and both of them looked at her and said nothing, which she took as the highest form of appreciation available from Cavendish men. She was happy. She noticed this with some wariness, the way a person notices they have walked onto ice and has not yet heard it creak. She was happy in a way that was specific, particular to this man, this village, these cold mornings with frost on the window glass. She was also aware, with her customary practicality, that her situation had not materially changed. She was still a second daughter with a restructured debt and a brother to manage. Julian was a duke. The distance between those positions was not incidental. The ton would have clear views about its arithmetic, and the ton's arithmetic had consequences for families that existed within its orbit. She had these thoughts, and then she got on with the day because Julian was coming at 2 o'clock, and she needed to finish a letter to the tenant farmer before then. He arrived at 2. He was carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What is that?" she said. "A pretext," he said. "I have reconsidered." She took it. Inside was a small old volume of Cowper, a 1798 edition from the Hartwell Library, with a bookplate and the faint smell of a room that had kept many winters. She turned to the front page. In faded ink, a dedication. "To my daughter, on the occasion of her managing our affairs with more intelligence and grace than I had any right to expect, with my admiration and love." Clara looked at this for a moment. "Who was she?" she said when she could manage it. "A great-aunt," Julian said. "She administered the estate for 11 years after her father's death and before her brother came of age. No one in the family talks about it particularly. I found it on the shelf." A pause. "I thought you would want to have it." Clara kept her eyes on the page. The dedication, the daughter, the admiration and love. "Julian," she said. "Yes. This is a very impractical gift." "I know." She looked up at him. He was watching her with the open expression, and something else beneath it that had been building for some time and was no longer quite contained. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome." The room was very quiet. The door was open as propriety required, but no one was in the hall. Julian was close. He had been close before, but this was different. Close with intention, close with something said and not yet said. "Clara," he said. Low and careful, which was how he said things he meant. "Yes," she said, not as a question. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, the same small gesture as before, and it undid her in exactly the same way, which she found both predictable and entirely beyond her capacity to prevent. "I have something to say," he said. "I have been attempting to say it for some days." "Say it," she said. "I love you," he said, directly, without the guarded approach or the tactical management of words, just the fact plainly stated, the way she had stated facts to him from the beginning. "I did not expect it, and I would not have chosen it, and it is, I am aware, a complicated situation in several respects. I have no illusions about what will be said when this becomes known in London, and I do not care. But there it is. I love you, Clara. I have loved you, I think, Since you left your calculations on my table and walked out of Hartwell Park. That was the first meeting, she said. Yes. You dismissed me extraordinarily badly in that meeting. I did, he said. It was clarifying. How in heaven's name was it clarifying? Because, he said with the ghost of a smile that was also entirely serious, you left and I watched you go and I wanted very badly to call you back. And I didn't. And then I thought about it for the rest of the day. He paused. And the day after that. Clara was quiet for a moment. The cowper was in her hands, the dedication still there, my admiration and love. I love you too, she said, simply in the same register he had used, because he had earned the unguarded version and she was tired of the fortress kind. He looked at her as if she had handed him something he had not expected to be allowed to have. Then, with the careful deliberateness that was entirely his, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not dramatic. It was not a performance. It was a man who had spent 5 years in armor, kissing a woman who had spent 3 years being formidably calm, and finding, in the middle of it, that neither of them had to be those things right now, in this room in December, with the door open and the spaniel asleep in the corner and the whole of Ashcroft entirely unaware. She kissed him back. The cowper fell to the chair. When they broke apart, they were both slightly altered, not dishevelled, not dramatic. Simply different in the way people are different when something has been decided that cannot be undecided. Well, Clara said. Yes, Julian agreed. The door is open. He looked at the open door. Quite right. He stepped back, exactly one step, which was decorum without retreat. She retrieved the cowper from the chair. She was aware that she was smiling and had no particular interest in composing her expression. Julian, she said. Clara. If this is leading somewhere. It is leading somewhere, he said immediately. Then you should know that I come with a restructured debt and a brother at school and tenant farmers and opinions about drainage and a family that is mine to manage. I am aware of all of this, he said. I have been paying close attention since October. And, he said, I would like to manage it with you, if you will permit me. She looked at him. That is not a proposal. No, he said, it is a preamble. He smiled, the full version, the one that was better than the portrait. I am working up to it. At your own pace, she said. Thank you for your patience. I have a great deal of it, she said, for things that are worth being patient about. He took her hand, not formally this time. Just her hand held in his, the way people hold things they intend to keep. The proposal came 4 days later. Not in a kitchen. In the library at Hartwell Park, which was where Julian had asked to show her something, a map of the Pembridge tenancy he had retrieved from the estate records, which he thought might be useful for her correspondence with the tenant farmers. It was a genuine pretext, and also, she had understood the moment she arrived, not entirely the point. The library was a fine room. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, 2 tall windows giving onto the park, a fire well made against the December cold. Julian had the map on the table, and they had been looking at it for 10 minutes when he straightened and turned to her, with the expression she had learned meant he had decided something. He did not kneel. He looked at her steadily, standing in the firelight of his own library, and said, Clara, will you marry me? She looked at the map. She looked at him. Yes, she said, obviously. Julian looked at her. Obviously? I have been extending my lodgings for 6 weeks, she said. Mrs. Carr's spaniel sleeps on my feet. I have read everything in the lending library. She turned to face him properly, and he saw that she was trying very hard not to smile, and failing. Yes, Julian, I will marry you. I have been intending to marry you for approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks, he said. The river path, she said. He stared at her. You decided on the river path. I decided I was in sufficient difficulty on the river path, she said with precision. The decision followed naturally. Julian Cavendish, Duke of Hartwell, who did not revise, who did not negotiate, who had maintained himself in careful order for 5 years against the encroachments of doubt and feeling and his own better nature, put his hands on Clara Pembridge's face and kissed her in the library of Hartwell Park, while the fire made the room amber and warm and the December park lay quiet beyond the windows. When they broke apart, she was still smiling, which was a thing he intended to spend a considerable time ensuring continued. Thomas, informed that evening over dinner at his house, looked at his brother and then at Clara and said, I am glad someone had the sense to manage this, and poured 3 glasses of wine. She managed it, Julian said. I had a drainage pamphlet, Clara said. Thomas looked between them. I don't want to know, he said, and drank his wine. They were married in February. Not in London, and not at Hartwell Park. In Ashcroft, at the church on the hill, on a morning that had started with frost and cleared by 10 o'clock to a thin winter sun that made the churchyard silver and the fields beyond it pale gold. Mrs. Holt attended and told everyone afterward that she had known from the very first week. This was not entirely accurate, but it was not entirely false, and she had earned the right to say it. The marriage required certain negotiations with the world at large. Julian had been clear about this from the beginning. He knew precisely what the Ton would say, and he had said so to Clara on the river path when he told her he did not care, and he had meant it. His solicitor had looked pained. His mother's cousin, who considered herself the family's social conscience, had written 2 letters that Julian had read once and placed in the fire. The world had its arithmetic, and Julian had revised his entirely, and that was the end of the matter as far as he was concerned. Clara was practical about it in a different way. She understood the cost. She had counted it before she had answered yes on the river path, and had decided, with clear eyes, that it was the correct sum. She was not naive about what she was entering. She was also not any longer willing to let other people's arithmetic determine what she was permitted to want. Thomas stood at Julian's side. The fact of this, the 2 of them at the front of a church, shoulder to shoulder, was perhaps the more remarkable reconciliation of the day, though they conducted it without remark, because they were both Cavendish men, and that was how they managed things of consequence. Clara noticed. She noticed everything. She did not say so. Her brother Edmund came from Winchester for the occasion, a tall, serious young man of 17, who shook Julian's hand with the gravity of someone who had rehearsed the encounter, and then looked at his sister and became briefly 17 again. "Is he good enough?" he asked her in the vestry, not quite quietly enough. "No," Clara said, "but he's improving." Julian, 2 feet away, heard this. His expression was the open one. They walked out of the church into the February light, and the village was there, not many. Only the people who had actually witnessed something over the preceding months. Mrs. Carr was there with the spaniel, who appeared to consider itself a participant. Thomas was there, and 1 or 2 of his friends from the village who were also now cautiously beginning to be Julians, which was a new category for all involved. The wedding breakfast was at Hartwell Park, because Clara had made certain practical concessions to the institution of marriage and to Julian's housekeeper, who had views. But the approach to the house, when they arrived, was lined with the estate's tenant farmers, who had come to see the new Duchess. This had not been arranged, they had simply come. Clara looked at them. She looked at Julian, who was looking at her with an expression that said, "I did not arrange this, and I am very glad because your face right now is worth more than anything I could have arranged." She straightened her back. She inclined her head. She thanked the nearest one by name and the next by name and the next, because she had done her reading, and she had learned long ago that the names were what mattered. And Julian watched her and thought, she has been managing things alone for 3 years, and she is going to be extraordinary at this, and I am going to spend the rest of my life ensuring she has the authority to match the competence. He said as much that evening, when they were finally alone. The guests were gone. The February dark had settled around Hartwell Park, and the fire in the sitting room was doing everything a fire should do, and they were in their own house, by their own fire, in the specific privacy that marriage had made legitimate. "I am going to be very inconvenient," Clara said. "As a wife, I should tell you now in case you had not fully considered it." "I have fully considered it," Julian said. He was sitting beside her, close in the way that was now officially sanctioned. "I have been considering it since October. I will have opinions about the estate management. Your opinions about drainage are excellent. I will correspond directly with the tenants. They will prefer it. Fossey is competent, but he lacks your ability to remember that people exist inside the numbers." She looked at him. "You notice that?" "I notice everything about you," he said. "I have done since October. It is, as I believe I mentioned, alarming." "I will argue with you," she said. "You have been arguing with me since the first meeting," he said. "I have been losing since approximately the second." She looked at him. He was watching her with the open face, the present tense face, the one she had seen beneath the armor on the very first day, and had not admitted for a long time that she was looking for. "The word," she said. He knew immediately. She could see him know. "Negotiate," he said. "You said it to me," she said, "in the churchyard. You said you had been thinking about it in a different context." "I had." He paused. "I was thinking that I had spent my entire adult life refusing to, that I had called it strength when it was the opposite." He looked at her. "And then I was thinking that you had come to my house, and offered me a negotiation in good faith, and I had dismissed you and you had walked out, and within the week you had found a better arrangement. With your brother. With my brother, he said without flinching, and I had watched you do it through a window and felt, I did not understand at the time what I felt. I told myself it was annoyance. Was it? It was something considerably more interesting than annoyance. He took her hand, the familiar gesture now permanent. It was the first time in 5 years that someone had walked into a situation I had decided was fixed, and simply declined to treat it as fixed. I had 2 copies of the proposal, Clara said. You always do. He smiled, the full version. That is what I have come to understand about you, Clara. You prepare for the walls and then you walk through them anyway. He paused. You walked through mine. I walked through a drainage system, she said. That sounds considerably less dramatic. You are not a dramatic woman, he said. That is one of the things I love most particularly about you. She looked at him. The firelight, the quiet house. The February dark outside and the estate beyond it. Theirs now, hers and his, to run and revise and manage in good faith. She leaned in and kissed him, not as a first kiss, not as a proposal, but as a woman in her own home by her own fire kissing her husband because she wished to, and there was no longer any reason to organize herself against it. He kissed her back with the full attention he gave to things he was taking seriously, which was everything about her, which had been true since October and was now permanent. When they broke apart, she looked at him and said, I should like to negotiate something. He looked at her steadily. Name your terms. Good faith on both sides, she said. That is all, that is the whole of it. Julian looked at her for a long moment. The firelight making the room amber, the dark outside the windows making the room entire. The woman beside him having walked through every wall he had built and arrived, somehow, here. Miss Pembridge, he said, deliberately. The old name, the first name, the name he had said in the morning room before he understood anything. He said it now like a joke and like a vow. Your Grace, she said in the same register. A pause. The fire settled. Outside, the Hartwell grounds lay under their February quiet. Frost on the fields, the river pewter in the dark, the village 2 miles away with its lending library and its lending library proprietress, who had known from the first week. Good faith on both sides, he said. Always. Always, she agreed. And that was the whole of it. That was enough.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.